Good morning, everyone. My name is Masangada, and I will be presenting a PowerPoint presentation on Introduction to Literary Genres in terms of poetry, how to read a poetic text, how to analyze a poetic text, and I think you might find this useful for the assignment and also the exams. Just remember that if you have any questions, or concerns or anything that you need to clarify on, please don't hesitate to click the email icon and drop me an email, and I will do my best to respond within 48 hours. Before I even get to the nitty-gritty of things, it is important to make this disclaimer that the contents of this particular presentation are not AI generated. So in essence, that means that all sources that have been consulted have been listed under references. And I do want to strongly encourage students to avoid using AI content for the assignments or the exams, as you will be heavily penalized for such. What we are going to cover in this presentation is going to be divided into 4 parts. So part 1 is going to look at introducing or an introduction to poetry in terms of what constitutes poetry and what exactly is a poetic text. And by understanding that, this helps you better understand how to answer questions that pertain to a poetic text. Then part 2, we're going to look at language in poetry. So by language, I mean the figurative and the metaphorical language. Then the third part, we're going to be looking at syntax in poetry. How is syntax formed in poetry? How is syntax deviated in poetry? And the fourth part, more last and most importantly, we're going to be looking at sound, rhythm, and meter in poetry. So part will be an introduction to poetry, which is reading and analyzing a poetic text. When you read a poetic text or understanding a poetic text, just bear in mind that a poetic text on its own is a language medium, so that's the key word, with an overarching voice. And this voice, created by the poet him or herself, is underpinned by tone, themes, and form. So how is the poet expressing this poem? What are the themes of this poetic text? And in what form has this poetic text been written? Has it been written as a villanelle? Has it been written as a Shakespearean sonnet? Has it been written as haiku? So that is what I mean when I talk about form. Then a poetic text, it expresses the poet's thoughts, emotions on a particular subject or theme. So when you receive a poetic text for an assignment and there are certain questions that you need to address, it's very important that you ask yourself as a student, what is it that the poet is trying to convey, and what is the overall subject or overall theme of that text? More importantly, when you read the text that is underpinned by a subject or a theme, which is embedded in the poet's thoughts and emotions, this also makes the poem itself open to interpretation. So what I mean by that is when asked what is the poem about, there isn't necessarily a right or wrong as long as you understand the themes, the overall themes of the poem, and what exactly the poet is trying to express. So while reading this text, which is open for interpretation. Poetry, in essence, is written in various forms, and by these various forms, I mean quatrain, a villanelle, a castich, a sonnet, a haiku, and there are many other forms in poetry. So before you even understand what the poem is about, first look at the form. What kind of poem am I reading? So if you're reading a poetic text by Robert Frost, ask yourself, okay, what form has Robert Frost written this poem in? Has he written it in the form of the villanelle? Has he written this poem in the form of a sonnet? So sometimes I find this very helpful for students when trying to answer questions that pertain to a poetic text and also just understanding the poetic text. And also, it is important to note that language in poetry is seen as a very important aesthetic in understanding a poetic text. And with that in mind, I've included some suggested reading material that you may find useful, helpful when understanding poetry in general. Poetry, in essence, can also be interpreted as a written form of art. And this is written in verses of lines where the following carry meaning to convey what the poet's intended message is. And by that, I mean it can be syntactical, it can be typographic, it can be strophic, and also contain sound-related elements of language. So this is what I essentially mean when poetry is interpreted as a form of art and it's written in verses of lines. And while bearing the above four key components in mind, take some time to try and answer some important questions, and you can use the box that I've included in the presentation to write your notes. Just take careful note that a PDF will be made available of this presentation. So, provide two interpretations of what, or two understandings of what poetry is. So, what is your understanding of poetry? And why is it that in certain occasions or in certain moments, a poetic text is very difficult to interpret? So take some time, ponder on those two questions and see if you can answer them and write your notes in that box. And also, last but most importantly, what would you consider as the three most important components that one should be consider when reading and interpreting a poetic text? Right. Then we're going to get to the part two, which is figurative and metaphorical language. Right. Text. This is just a reminder that reading a poetic text is underpinned by these 5 elements. Please ignore number 3 as that is a slight typo, but nevertheless, just remember that a poetic text is underpinned by the figurative language. So what kind or what figurative language has the poet used to convey the overall theme? Then we have the metaphorical language, which is basically identifying the metaphorical language or the metaphorical constructions in a poetic text. Then we look at the use of syntax. So what syntactic deviation has the poet used to convey intended themes or messages of the poem, and also rhythm and meter. And this again, it speaks to the poem's form, and structure. So when we understand a poetic text in terms of a textual response to poetry, it is important to make use of the following notes. So look at the title of the poem and put it into context. So in other words, contextualize the title of the poetic text because that gives you an idea of what the poem is about. Secondly, in the form of a small paragraph, and I do find that students find this useful when trying to interpret a poem or answering questions about poetry. You have to write a summary of the poem which is based on the following. What is the poem about? What is the poem's overall mood? And also, what is the poem's structure? Okay, so take these three important components and summarize it in the form of a small paragraph, approximately 250 words, before you even start answering questions that you're given in the assignment. And then also, what is the form of this poem? So, has the poet written a Shakespearean sonnet or um, a villanelle or haiku, a concrete poem, an epigram, quatrain? That is what I'm referring to. And also, what is the overall tone of the poem? Is the poet writing this poem that deals with the themes of loss and love in a melancholic manner? Is it written in a manner of despair? So that is what I essentially mean by that. And also, what literary devices has the poet used in this poetic text? And I will get into that in a moment. Then, when you study a poetic text, I think it is important to keep in mind that it is anchored by the literary aesthetic, which is known as Russian formalism. So Russian formalism is defined as how poetry, which is a literary genre, applies structural elements in poetry and foregrounds them. This makes the familiar word or a well-known word in a poetic text sound strange or absurd or even illogical. So you will notice that as I present this PowerPoint, you will see that a lot of the references I include in the presentation is from your tutorial letter. So it is very important that students actively consult the tutorial letter. Because by consulting the tutorial letter, it is the only way you can excel in this module in poetry, in drama, and also interpreting the narrative text. And again, you will see that at the bottom in bold, I have written that you need to consult your tutorial letter study unit 1 on forming a close reading of a poetic text. When we look at the figurative language versus the literal language in poetry, it is essential to keep in mind that reading a poetic text, the use of figurative language is applicable to lines in a poem that convey or evoke ideas or statements made by the poet without a direct interpretation. So that is what the figurative language entails. In other words, this is an idea or a statement presented by the poet that is not interpreted in a literal manner. And the figurative language is also known or interpreted as a linguistic device where the language used in the poem sounds absurd, illogical, and unrealistic. And also with the figurative language, it is also termed as a figure of speech. And I think this is where a lot of students struggle when asked to define what is the figurative language versus the metaphorical language. So just remember that the figurative language is termed as a figure of speech. And with this in mind, some examples of figurative language of which are applicable in poetry are your simile, your metaphor, your personification, the use of symbolism in poetry, the use of metonymy in poetry, the poet's use of allegory, poet's use of hyperbole, and also an onomatopoeia. So this is how the figurative language or a figure of speech in poetry is interpreted as. And very important to note that for more information and relevant examples of this, please remember to refer to a tutorial letter, study unit 2. So, an example of figurative language in Robert Frost's poetic text, which is titled Neither Out Far Nor In Deep. Here is the poetic text. So here, my approach to this particular text is to identify what is to acknowledge the figure of speech used and why this particular figure of speech has been used and how it contributes to the poet's intention of writing this poem. So you will see that I signposted line 6 and signposted line 9 and gave my own interpretation of Frost's use of the figurative language in poetry. And I think when you read a poetic text, I find that it's always useful to make use of this, which could be useful. But if it is still unclear to you, please don't hesitate to drop me an email. So another example is when we refer to a South African poem titled Walking by well-known poet Mxolisi Nyezwa, and we identify through examples that are indicative of figurative language. It is, in terms of the assignment, it is important that you indicate the line number and quote that line. So when asked to identify an example of a figure of speech or figurative language used, it is important to state figurative language is identified in line 1, for example, and then afterwards you quote that line. And with that in mind, just remember the following, that to gain a very clear understanding of the poetic text, just remember, before you even touch on the questions, just write a brief summary that captures your understanding of the text. And from then onwards, you identify the literary devices that, for example, this poet uses to convey the overall tone or mood of the text. So see if you can do that in your own spare time as a way to practice to interpret a poetic text, to understand a poetic text, and so forth. And I think you will find this a very helpful method for your assignment and also for your exam. Also, when you interpret a poetic text, this is just an example of how I would summarize Mxolisi Nyezwa's poetic text. You can also use the same method if you find it easier, as opposed to just writing a paragraph. And again, you are given the option to make use of notes here. With the literal language, the Britannica Dictionary defines the literal language as one that is concerned with the direct and apt meaning of something. So in a poetic text, for example, the literal language is mostly concerned with the poet's expression, but this is done in a direct way without using figurative language or figure of speech. So, for example, in stanza one of Craig O'Flaherty's poetic text, the literal language is identified in the lines that I have circled um, in this text. So, with that in mind, can you then differentiate between the literal and the metaphorical language in poetry? And see if you can do that by making some notes here. With the metaphorical language, again, it's important to note that the metaphorical language is a figure of speech in poetry, which is the commonmost feature, commonmost feature identified in a poetic text. So your metaphorical language is characterized by the relationship between disparate things or other instances or occurrences. And the metaphorical language also describes one phenomenon to another phenomenon, um, because the relationship between these two phenomena is quite different. So this, in essence, is one of the important characteristics of the figurative language in poetry. So, for example, here I've written, she has experienced a roller coaster of emotions during the exam period. So, the phrase that is in orange is indicative of the metaphorical language. And then the second example, I decided to borrow it from one of T.S. Eliot's famous poems, Hollow Men. And a very good example of the metaphorical language here is line 1 and line 2, which is, "We are the hollow men, we are the stuffed men." And it's also important to remember that with the metaphorical language applied in poetry, it actually subverts or deviates from the literal construction of a poetic text. And please remember to consult page 18 for this if you need more clarity. The metaphorical construction in poetry, before we even get to investigate these foregrounding techniques in poetry, it is important to remember that the metaphorical construction in poetry communicates the text's overall meaning expressed by the poet in a very divergent manner. So, in essence, you have to ask yourself, okay, how is the metaphor constructed? And here I have included examples, which is the focus and framework construction, the tenor and vehicle construction, the genitive construction, and the sentence metaphor. So you will see that for each metaphorical construction in this graph, I have indicated a brief explanation of each. Part 3, we're going to be looking at syntax poetry. Syntactic organization in poetry is underpinned by 3 important elements, and that is the extra patterning, contravening of grammatical rules or the rules of grammar, and overregulation or extra patterning of that syntax. And you have to ensure that you consult your tutorial later for this, especially in study unit 3 for examples and explanations of these 3 components. And this mind map essentially breaks down how syntax in poetry is organized. So at the syntactic deviation. And when you compose or write a poem, create a sentence that is well crafted, there are three things that must be carefully executed. The first one, you need to purposefully break or deviate from the rules of grammar. Number two, create extra patterning that exceeds what is essentially or normally expected. And number three, you have to introduce the reader about how lines and sentences in a poetic text are structured or written in an unexpected way. So to avoid being flagged for plagiarism in an assignment or exam, you have to use these three key points above and write your own interpretation. You'll see that what I did here was that I gave my own interpretation of such, but also ensured that I used in-text referencing. And here I've included a section where you can make your own notes here on the syntactic deviation. But most importantly, we're going to be looking at sound, rhythm, and meter. Sound in poetry, for most poems, creating a poem is a creative journey where the writer and the words that they use work together to create something that is more meaningful than what they originally are. So the poetic text is essentially shaped by its form and words, as well as the sounds the sounds of these words that are used. So as a result, the poet is able to engage with his or her senses, which are heightened when using sound in poetry. And sound devices in poetry are therefore applied. For example, the poet's use of consonants, the poet's use of euphony, onomatopoeia, dissonance, alliteration, and repetition. So when we look at sound in poetry and horizontal sound pattern, so with the vertical and horizontal sound pattern, always remember to ask yourself this important question: what words are being repeated and in what lines? And are these repeated words done vertically or horizontally? So essentially here, the horizontal sound pattern are words that are repeated within the same line. And this in essence contributes to the poem's overall mood, theme, and structure of a poetic text. Whereas your vertical sound pattern poetry are words that are repeated in more than two lines, more than one line, but this is done in a vertical structure. So with that, just remember to consult your tutorial letter, study unit 4, page 37, and see if you can analyze the poetic text and identify examples of the vertical and horizontal sound pattern. And when asked to identify examples, remember to highlight or underline examples that are indicative of the vertical and the horizontal sound pattern. If, for example, we were to refer to Nyezo's poetic text, this is a task that I would encourage you to do in your own time. What would you say are the relevant sound devices found in the poetic text? So essentially, here you would have to name the device and quote the line. But I do have to stress that if, for example, you choose assonance or alliteration, for example, you need to obviously state it is assonance, You quote the line, right, and indicate the line number. And within that quoted line, you need to highlight or indicate the example within that line that is indicative of assonance or alliteration. Okay, so see if you can take some time and read through this poetic text and identify what are the relevant sound devices that Nyezo has applied in this text. And also, can you identify examples of the vertical sound pattern or the horizontal sound pattern? Here we get to rhythm and meter. So with rhythm, while poetry is interpreted as a concentrated form of language, rhythm forms a very important part because it is a highly concentrated form of language, and this contains a number of syllables, and these syllables in essence can be vowels or vowel sounds on its own, or a vowel that is accompanied with consonants. And in words that contain two or more syllables, one syllable is usually given more emphasis or more stress than the others. And this, in essence, creates a sequence of stressed and unstressed syllables when we speak. So therefore, rhythm is the pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables in poetry, and this creates musical quality to the language constructed in the poetic text. So it is important that in poetry, it creates movement. Rhythm creates a sense of movement and a sense of flow in the words, and this helps convey the emotions and the meaning of the poetic text. So with the unstressed and unstressed syllables in rhythm, when reading a poetic text with stressed and unstressed syllables, this is called scansion. So scansion is essentially used to determine the text metrical feet, and you will see that these two icons here are examples of what is a stressed syllable and what is an unstressed syllable. And you will see that this example here I have taken from Nyezwa's poetic text, and with that I wrote, okay, this is what has been stressed and this is what has not, but this is what has been unstressed. So please again ensure that you consult study unit 5 for more insight into rhythm and examples of rhythm. Then with meter, this refers to study unit 5, so please remember to consult that as well. And a poet's rhythm is called meter, and this basically means the recurrence of regular units that are about the same length. So meter has been a defining feature of poetry, and this in essence creates a poem's structure. And with this in mind, meter is subdivided into various kinds. So we get the iambic, trochaic, anapestic, amphorik, spondaic, and the dactyl or dactylic. So it's very important again that you refer to study unit 5 just to get more insight into what meter is, how one identifies the metrical length, and so forth. And here are my sources consulted for this presentation, and you'll also to write more notes here from this presentation. And with that in mind, if you have any questions or concerns or anything that you need clarity on, please don't hesitate to send me an email and I will happily respond. So thank you very much and take care.